We're covering the lymphatic system in this system because the lymphatic system is a second circulatory system. Typically when we look at a picture like this, it's filled with blood vessels. We don't even notice the lymphatic vessels. Here they've only left a few major blood vessels. They've removed the blood vessels to show us that wherever there are blood vessels, there are lymphatic vessels. And so all of these green vessels that you see infiltrating all the different areas of the body, those are lymphatic vessels. And you can also see these little nodules along the lymphatic vessels, and those are lymph nodes. So the lymphatic system is a second circulatory system. Here's another depiction of the lymphatic system paralleling the cardiovascular system. So what we can see as far as the cardiovascular system goes is what we know, that oxygenated blood is pumped out to the systemic circulation. It provides oxygen and nutrients through the capillary bed. But what I'm noticing in this picture is wherever there is a blood capillary bed, it looks like there's also a lymphatic capillary. And we know that venules and veins return deoxygenated blood to the heart. And in the same token, I can see that the lymphatic system, that these lymphatic capillaries form bigger vessels. They're called lymphatic vessels, and those lymphatic vessels have lymph nodes all along their path, but ultimately the lymphatic vessels are dumping the lymph back into the blood. Another comparison I want to make between the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system is in the cardiovascular system, in this circuit, notice there's a heart. So we've talked about the heart. The heart is a pump that's pushing the blood through that system. The lymphatic system doesn't have a pump. It's circulating a clear fluid called lymph. It's not circulating blood, it's circulating lymph. And there's no pump in this system, which means that all of this movement is going to be under very low pressure and very slow. As a matter of fact, lymphatic vessels have a structure similar to veins. Remember how veins have a very weak muscular wall and they contain valves because the fluid is under such low pressure. Same thing with the lymphatic vessels. With lymphatic vessels, there are no such thing as an artery or a vein. It's just called a lymphatic vessel, but the structure is like a vein, thin-walled, with valves that try to help with one direction flow. Let's take a look at the relationship between blood, interstitial fluid, and lymph. So we know all exchange between the blood and our tissues and organs occurs at the level of the capillary. Okay, so inside the capillary would be blood, all the various types of blood cells, plasma, water, proteins, and then bathing the blood vessel is a clear watery fluid called interstitial fluid. And we also know that wherever there is a blood capillary, there is a lymphatic capillary. So let's add that into our picture. And just like a blood capillary is made out of simple squamous epithelial tissue, a lymphatic capillary is too, but the arrangement of those cells is different. It's kind of like shingles on a roof, right? So let's make this the lymphatic capillary. So as blood flows through the capillary, we know that blood contains the cells, water, protein, like we were saying. I'm going to make these dots protein. Occasionally what's going to happen is a protein will slip out of the blood, which is no problem at all, but it can't get back into the blood. So now it's trapped out here in the interstitial fluid. So capillaries are typically porous enough to allow that protein back in. So it's just stuck out there, which is fine. But you can imagine that over time, as more proteins slip out of the blood, they start to accumulate out here. And as proteins accumulate over time, what can happen is the concentration of protein in the interstitial fluid can actually become greater than the concentration of protein inside of the blood. And when we have a greater concentration of protein in one compartment, lower concentration of protein in the other compartment, it makes me think back to AP1, simple diffusion, that particles want to move from the area of high concentration into the area of low concentration, which is the case, but it just can't happen because the proteins are too big and the capillary is not porous enough. So plan B is always osmosis. We can see that there's a higher water concentration inside of the blood than there is inside of the interstitial fluid, and that is because so many proteins have slipped out of the blood and accumulated in the interstitial fluid that it made it more concentrated. And so water will move from its area of high concentration into its area of low concentration just by osmosis. And when water moves to dilute out the interstitial fluid, what's going to happen is the volume of interstitial fluid goes up. And when you increase the volume of this fluid, that will also increase the pressure of the interstitial fluid. And that increased pressure is what can drive the interstitial fluid right into a lymphatic capillary. And once the interstitial fluid, the water and the proteins that are trapped out here, once the interstitial fluid is inside of a lymphatic capillary, now we call it lymph. So the interstitial fluid is now called lymph. All lymph is interstitial fluid that's inside of a lymphatic capillary, and that's why the lymphatic system is a second circulatory system that's circulating interstitial fluid. So now that we understand that the lymphatic system is actually circulating interstitial fluid, doesn't it make sense that that interstitial fluid, before being returned to the blood, needs to get cleaned up? That's the job of a lymph node. So you can see that when interstitial fluid is driven into the lymphatic capillaries, and we call it lymph, that once that lymph starts traveling within the lymphatic system, it will pass through many lymph nodes on the way back to the blood. And so taking a look at a picture of a lymph node, here you can see lymphatic vessels conveying lymph into the lymph node. And all a lymph node is a nodule of tissue that has lots of lymphocytes living in it. You can see it's going to be a little bit like a maze for the lymph to make it through the lymph node, and so it's getting cleaned up. Lymphocytes and other white blood cells are going to take out any cellular debris, pathogens, and so on. And so that interstitial fluid, or the lymph, gets cleaned within the lymph node, and then it exits the lymph node, and it's going to hit many lymph nodes before it gets returned to the blood. We have lymph nodes all over the body, but there are 5 locations where lymph nodes are clustered. And so you can see that there's a cluster of lymph nodes located in the neck region. Those are called the cervical lymph nodes. The cluster of lymph nodes located underneath the arm, those are the axillary lymph nodes. There are the thoracic lymph nodes, abdominal lymph nodes, and then the inguinal lymph nodes are the ones that are located in the groin area. All of the lymph nodes do the same thing. They clean the lymph before returning it to the blood. So we've been looking at this simple depiction showing us that lymph is returned to the blood just before it enters the heart. Let me show you that a little bit more specifically. This is a picture from our book that's showing where the lymphatic vessels, they're actually called collecting ducts, will empty back into the blood, and I enlarged it here so you can see it. There's 2 locations. This is the right lymphatic duct. You can see it merging into the junction between, this is the internal jugular vein, and this is the subclavian vein. Okay, this is brachiocephalic vein. And then on the left, this is the bigger of the 2. This is called the thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct, those are the 2 spots where lymph gets returned to the blood. Once lymph is returned to the blood, we would call that exact same fluid plasma. And you can see it's going to go right into the superior vena cava, right into the right atrium, and become part of the blood. Let's finish by marking up the notes together. I'm at the bottom of page 14. So as far as interstitial fluid, we know that's that clear fluid that bathes our body cells. And so the way that that forms is that small proteins occasionally slip out of the capillary. These proteins can't re-enter the capillary, so they're trapped out there in the extracellular space. Over time, they accumulate. That's going to create an osmotic gradient. And water will move out of the blood through the capillary wall into the interstitial fluid. So that's how interstitial fluid forms. And as the volume of interstitial fluid increases, we know the pressure of that fluid will increase. And it's that increased pressure that's going to drive interstitial fluid into the lymphatic capillary. And once it's inside of the lymphatic capillary, now we're going to call it lymph. The path that lymph takes is that once it enters into the lymphatic capillary, which the lymphatic capillaries parallel blood capillaries, it will enter into a lymphatic vessel. Remember, there is no such thing as an artery or vein in the lymphatic system, but the structure and function of the lymphatic vessels are very similar to a vein. And along the path, it will flow through lymph nodes. And the purpose of a lymph node, the function, is to filter and clean the lymphatic fluid as it moves through the lymph node. Lymph nodes are located all over the place, but there are 5 regions where they're clustered. We looked at that. And then finally, the lymph will return to the blood at the level of the collecting duct. So right in left subclavian veins is where we find the thoracic duct on the left and the right lymphatic duct. And we talked about the fact that there's no pump. So the pressure inside the lymphatic system is very low. It's basically dependent on skeletal muscle movement, including breathing. And if there is an obstruction of lymph flow, what will happen is lymph will accumulate downstream from that area. That's a condition called lymphedema.